Hi, I'm Steven, and this is the second episode of Bookshelf A to Z, a series where I read and discuss all of the books I own from A to Z. And this particular episode is about Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. I hope I got his name pronounced correctly there. There's a lot of African names in this novel, and I will endeavor my best to pronounce them correctly. Um, but this novel is actually one that I've read before. I read it in a ninth grade world literature class, so when I was 14. And it was well regarded by my class. Not that that says much because we didn't really go into the details, the details that I'll talk about later, the idea of colonialism and the effect on masculinity and whatnot, but we'll get into that later. Things Fall Apart follows the life of the Igbo warrior farmer Okonkwo, and it describes the cultures and practices of a pre-colonial Nigerian village of Umuofia, where Okonkwo lives, and takes great pains to discuss, um, I guess, fill in the details of what a pre-colonial Nigerian village would look like. And in that sense, the first part of the novel actually takes place before British colonial rule. Okonkwo is a man nearly at the pinnacle of Igbo society. He's rich, he's a great warrior, he's famous for his ability of wrestling, he has multiple wives and children, he's taken titles within the village of Umuofia where he lives. He's a community leader whom other men come to for advice and for help. And he is, in short, the ideal man in this pre colonial period, which is a large departure from what his father was. Okonkwo's father was. Okonkwo's father, Unoka, was a layabout, somebody who didn't like to farm, who didn't like to go to war, who didn't like to do anything, and because of that, ended up dying in shame, in debt, and was actually thrown, not given a proper burial because of the way he died. Okonkwo, of course, saw that and said, "No, none of that. I'm not going to be like that at all," and became the man that he was, a tough, strong, rich man. The novel, however, takes place almost kind of, it's not one continuous narrative per se, but rather several shorter anecdotes throughout Okonkwo's life. And the most important one, at least in part one, is that of Ikemefuna. Ikemefuna is a boy who is taken from another village as a hostage. So what happened was that somebody from the village of Umuofia was killed, and in lieu of that payment, two hostages were given to Umuofia, one of whom was Ikemefuna. Ikemefuna was given to Okonkwo to take care of because, somebody has to take care of the boy. And Okonkwo, being rich, was seen as somebody who could do that for them. Uh, at first, Okonkwo does not like Ikemefuna because why would you want another mouth to feed? But over time, uh, over the course of 3 years specifically, Ikemefuna becomes almost like a son to Okonkwo. He seems to be a good worker. He works hard. He embodies all of the masculine traits which Okonkwo likes, and he is a good influence on Okonkwo's biological son, Nwoye, something which Okonkwo is very much happy about. And it gets to the point that Okonkwo actually starts to begin to love Ikemefuna, uh, as if that he is his own son. But after 3 years, Umuofia decides that they're going to go to war with the village that Ikemefuna came from, And so the boy has to be killed. Despite the fact that Okonkwo is pretty much the chief warrior of Umuofia, everybody recognizes that it would be wrong to make him kill Ikemefuna. And so Okonkwo is told not to participate in the murder. However, Okonkwo, because he is afraid of being thought weak, like his father was, he is the one that ultimately takes the killing blow on the young man. And the death of Ikemefuna is a particularly haunting passage, so I'll read it here. As the man who had cleared his throat drew up and raised his machete, Okonkwo looked away. He heard the blow. The pot fell and broke in the sand. He heard Ikemefuna cry, "My father, they have killed me." As he ran towards him, dazed with fear, Okonkwo drew his machete and cut him down. He was afraid of being thought weak. Oh, that's such a good line. He was afraid of being thought weak. It says so much about Okonkwo as a character in that one moment that he would rather kill his somebody that he loves instead of being thought weak in front of the village. And we'll get more into that later. But despite all of this, Okonkwo is not wholly without any sort of redeeming qualities at all. For example, he loves his daughter Zinma very much, which is not like, congratulations, you like your daughter, well done. But he does take special care of her. He goes out and gathers medicines for her whenever she's sick. At one point in time, a priestess of the village comes and collects her, for some sort of ritual. And Okonkwo is very worried about her and goes out into the pitch darkness to follow along with the priestess. Something that, which is a lot more brave than it sounds, given that it's pitch black and one doesn't follow priestesses. But he goes out just to make sure that she's safe, and it's seen as a positive. I think it's intended to be a positive, and I probably do it very little justice. It is worth reading. But I don't know. It's hard to see Okonkwo as a positive person if you haven't read the books or the book. But it's almost like he's kind of like a Greek hero in a tragedy. He is somebody whom we, as modern people in wherever you happen to be, but I'm in America, but wherever you happen to be, might think of as negative. But within that pre-colonial Nigeria, it is something that is a positive. Like Achilles is not a great man, how we would view somebody who would be a great man, but in that culture, in that specific time frame, he was great. And I think that's what you're supposed to take away from about Okonkwo, is that we don't think of him as being a great hero and a great man, but he would have been a great man in that particular place and time. Part one comes to an end in tragedy for Okonkwo, though. In the village of Umuofia and Igbo society, it is seen as a great sin to kill one of your fellow villagers, even by accident. And during a feast in the village, Okonkwo is firing his gun with everybody else, and his gun explodes, and a piece of the metal ends up killing a young man. And because of this, Okonkwo is exiled from the village of Umuofia for 7 years. He is exiled. And that's where book one ends. Part two details those 7 years and what Okonkwo does. And with it, there is a change. The British colonial rule has started to show up. No longer are they just happy and content to say that they own the land. They are going to rule the land as well. When a village fights against the British rule, they see a white man and their gods tell them, this is no good. We got to do away with this. So they kill a messenger, a British messenger. And in retaliation, the British government gathers up all the people into the marketplace and massacres them. And that is the first thing you hear about with the British colonial. That's the first thing that you're like, oh, these white people they're coming. That's it. So a little background. There is no date for the book. It doesn't say like when it takes place. However, I think that it would be around the time of the 1880s, specifically around the Berlin Conference, which created the Oil River Protectorate, which is the British holding. And it was about then where Britain really started to enforce its will on Nigeria and occupying the rule. And I believe that's about when Okonkwo was exiled. So the book probably takes place from like 1860 to 1890-ish. But it never really specifies. So just, if you're looking for a time frame. So most villagers, seeing what has happened to the one village that gets destroyed, most of the villages, including Umuofia, decide it's probably best not to openly fight. And they just kind of give in to the British colonial rule. And part of that is to let the religious missionaries in. And the missionaries at first, most of the villagers think that they're just kind of funny. They're weird. They're not a threat. It's just, why would anybody be part of them? And the village plays a number of jokes on the missionaries. So the missionary comes to the village elders and they're like, we would like to build a church. And the village says, yeah, fine, you can have the cursed land. Go for it. And the missionaries say, cool. And they take the cursed land. And then stuff like that just kind of keeps happening. And over time, though, the mission never goes away because it's supported by the British government. So obviously the mission isn't going to fail. But over time, because of that, a number of villagers slowly start to convert to Christianity. One of the biggest persons, and one of the biggest disruptions in Okonkwo's life is when Nwoye, his biological son, converts. He abandons Okonkwo's family, leaves them completely, converts to Christianity, and Okonkwo never sees him again. And that's it. Okonkwo refuses to talk to him. Nwoye refuses to talk to Okonkwo. That's it. Although, it is worth noting that Nwoye is the father of the main character in the next book that we'll read, No Longer at Ease, which I think is important. It's just an interesting connection. And I'll talk about more of that when I talk about that book. But that connection is important to the themes of Things Fall Apart. And it's just interesting. Eventually, Okonkwo returns back to Umuofia, and he hates what he sees is happening. He hates the conversion of his people. He hates that the British colonial rule is there. He hates everything. And he says, we should fight. We should fight these people. We should get rid of the Christians. We should kill everyone. And we should just, we should be men about it. And the village elders say, we should. They agree with him. And they plan a meeting of the whole village together. And Okonkwo is, he's happy. He's riding high. Until the village meeting happens. And the British colonial police force shows up to close down the meeting, shut down the meeting, and Okonkwo, not having any of it, he kills the messenger from the British colonial rule. But the village of Umuofia does not follow him. They don't get the rest of the messengers. They just leave him there, having killed somebody, and they don't do anything about it. And it's in that moment that Okonkwo realizes it's over. He's lost. He is singular in wanting to fight against British colonial rule, and because of that, Okonkwo goes and he commits suicide. And that is how the book ends, with Okonkwo, a stand-in, if you will, for Nigeria, dead to colonial rule. So obviously this is a much quicker overview than what you would get from actually reading the book. You should read the book. It's very short. It's only about 200 pages, much shorter than Jerlaine, and it is significantly better. And I hope you do read it. So, before we continue, I do think it's necessary to describe the basic framework in which I'm going to look at Things Fall Apart and Okonkwo as a character. If for no other reason than because I think literary theory is often seen as useless at best and unnecessarily complicating at worst. But, you wouldn't build a house without first building the frame, and you wouldn't try to deep dive into a novel without first understanding the basics of literary theories that you'll be using. So I think it's necessary. I don't know. In our handy dictionary of literary terms and theories, we can see that post-colonial critics are concerned with the impact of colonialism generally, including its relationship with issues such as gender and class. Post-colonialism is the most natural fit for the African trilogy, and is especially fitting given Achebe's previously discussed contributions to post-colonial literary theory, and his stated goal in writing Things Fall Apart of rebutting the traditional view of Africa and Africans in literature up to that point. With Things Fall Apart, we're going to spend more time on gender and the effect of that colonialism had on gender, specifically the effect on the demasculinization of black men and how that is shown in Things Fall Apart. And because of that, gender as a term is somewhat of a hot topic lately, and unfortunately it is necessary to jump into it here because Things Fall Apart is all about gender. And I'll speak briefly here, only to say that in our dictionary of critical theory, we can see that the differentiation between sex and gender is a much longer thought about idea than some would choose to believe. Robert Stoller at the California Gender Identity Center found that, from the 40s, found that in cases where genital malformation resulted in erroneous gender assignment at birth, that is to say, people who were intersex, it was far easier to undo the biological effects of the gender assignment than to unravel the psychological effects of having lived as the wrong gender. Thus began the realization, as Anne Oakley would later argue, that sex was a biological term, but gender was a social and psychological term. There are countless studies showing the ways in which we treat men and women differently, even from a young age. And in order to not make the video longer than it has to be, I will only say that there seems to be a general consensus amongst experts that our gender is greatly influenced by these social pressures and expectations around us, which I bring up since it will be fundamental to how we view Okonkwo and his actions. Okonkwo is obsessed with his masculinity. It is almost exclusively what he thinks about, and is always worried that he won't be seen as being manly enough by the other members of his tribe and his family. He worries constantly about it, I read earlier the passage where he kills Ikemefuna, and importantly, the reason that he does so is so that he isn't thought weak. We see that he doesn't like women's stories because, as a man, he is above them. He doesn't take notice of his children except when Azimba is dying or in danger, and then he goes out to protect them only in the night when no one can see him. He beats his wives, not because he dislikes them, but because he thinks that that is what is expected of him. He takes titles because it indicates to the village that he's a powerful man, uh, going so far as to rebuke another villager who hadn't taken any titles yet by implying that the titleless man was a woman. And it is not just his own masculinity that he is worried about. Several times he either thinks to himself or else mentions to his friends how he is worried about Nuoye, his son, and how he will grow up to be. One of the things that endears Ikemefuna to the man is how he helps to guide Nuoye into being a better man. And it isn't just Nuoye. On at least 2 occasions, he says how it is a shame that Azinma, his daughter, isn't a man because of how many masculine traits he sees in the girl. But unfortunately for her, or perhaps fortunately given how he treats his son, she can never truly be the heir that her father wishes her to be. We are given the reason early on in the novel for this obsession. It is a worry bred from how people viewed Unoka, Okonkwo's father. Unoka, as said earlier, was a man that didn't like to work and didn't like to go to war. He liked to play his flute. Unoka loved it all, and he loved the first kites that returned with the dry season and the children who sang songs of welcome to them. He would remember his own childhood, how he had often wandered around looking for a kite sailing leisurely against the blue sky. As soon as he found one, he would sing with his whole being, welcoming it back from its long, long journey and asking if it had brought home any lengths of cloth. Unoka, the grown-up, was a failure. He was poor, and his wife and children had barely enough to eat. People laughed at him because he was a loafer. They swore never to lend him any more money because he never paid back. But Unoka was such a man that he always succeeded in borrowing more. When Unoka died, he had taken no title at all, and he was heavily in debt. Any wonder then that his son Okonkwo was ashamed of him. Leaving aside the colonial narrative for a minute, the story of Okonkwo is a personal tragedy, which is, of course, why the novel works as well as it does. Okonkwo's father isn't a bad man. He isn't a cruel man. What he was a man wholly unsuited for the society in which he lived. One can easily imagine that had Unoka lived in a different place or a different time, he might have been an artist or a musician. But that wasn't an option for him in pre-colonial Nigeria, and so we see the first tragedy of the book. We have a man whose son reviles him because that man cannot live up to the daily realities that he faces, much in the same way that that son, Okonkwo, will also fail as a father. Unoka dies ignobly of an unspecified wasting disease. This disease marks him as an abomination, and therefore Unoka isn't given the proper burial rites, and thus, though father and son are so different, and though Okonkwo spent his entire adult life abhorring his father, they both share the same fate. They both die as abominations, and neither will receive the burial that they deserve, nor the mourning from the sons that they both left. I said that Things Fall Apart is a novel about the personal tragedy of Okonkwo's life, but it is more than that. It is a generational tragedy, and though this novel ends with the death of Okonkwo, we'll see in the next volume, No Longer at Ease, that the generational tragedy didn't just end with Okonkwo, but continued on to his son Nuaye and on to his grandson Obi. But, to return to Okonkwo, what strikes me about his version of masculinity is how very modern it feels. Today, we would use the term toxic masculinity to describe the gender expectations that Okonkwo enforces. One would think that it would be unnecessary to specify what toxic masculinity is, but this is still the internet, and it's best to be clear so as not to be misinterpreted. Toxic masculinity, as defined by the New York Times, is a set of behaviors and beliefs that include suppressing emotions or masking distress, maintaining an appearance of hardness, violence as an indicator of power, and that to be anything other than these things would make a man feminine or weak. It is not pointedly, I might add, that all men are bad, or everything that is masculine is bad. It is traits that are traditionally seen as masculine that lead to a lessening of life for both men and those around them. Okonkwo is a wonderful example of this kind of masculinity. He constantly frets about being seen as womanly and weak. He beats his wives and children. He pretends not to feel love or pride in his children. Uh, he pretends not to be sad about the death of Ikemefuna, despite the fact that he can't sleep for days afterwards. He is constantly asserting his own power against those that he feels are weaker than him, and what does he gain from it? His wives are scared of him, his son breaks contact with him in favor of a foreign faith and culture, and ultimately his village turns its back on him. But it was worth it, no doubt, when he was powerful and rich and alone, hanging from a tree in his yard. Unless we are to say that this is merely a novel and not reflective of the real life consequences of harmful ideas of masculinity, we need only to see that the CDC shows that men commit suicide at nearly 4 times the rate of women. But then, if the masculinity of Okonkwo is so modern, and so similar to the masculinity of what we would think of the modern patriarchal system, how could it be subversive in the ways that Achebe wrote it to be? In order to understand that, we need to understand how Africa and Africans were seen in literature prior to Things Fall Apart, and where better than to look at Achebe's own literary criticism, specifically his famous An Image of Africa, Racism in Conrad's Heart of Darkness. Heart of Darkness is the famous novella by Joseph Conrad, and is the story of a European man's trip down the Congo River and the corrupting nature of native life on white colonial men. I actually thought I had a copy of it somewhere here, but it turns out that I don't, so I don't know. Maybe I'll get a copy so that we can read it come, what is it, C for Conrad, but I don't know. I have a lot of books, so maybe we won't. We'll see. Achebe writes on Heart of Darkness that it projects the image of Africa as the other world, the antithesis of Europe and therefore civilization, a place where man's vaunted intelligence and refinement are finally mocked by triumphant bestiality. And like Achebe, I will quote directly from Conrad to best show how Africans were seen. So this is a quote from Heart of Darkness. We were wanderers on a prehistoric Earth, on an Earth that wore the aspect of an unknown planet. We could have fancied ourselves the first men taking possession of an accursed inheritance, to be subdued at the cost of profound anguish and of excessive toil. But suddenly, as we struggled round a bend, there would be a glimpse of rush walls, of peaked grass roofs, a burst of yells, a whirl of black limbs, a mass of hands clapping, of feet stamping, of bodies swaying, of eyes rolling under the droop of heavy and motionless foliage. The steamer toiled along slowly on the edge of a black and incomprehensible frenzy. The prehistoric man was cursing us, praying to us, welcoming us. Who could tell? We were cut off from the comprehension of our surroundings. We glided past like phantoms, wondering and secretly appalled as sane men would before an enthusiastic outbreak in a madhouse. We could not understand because we were too far, and could not remember because we were traveling in the night of first ages, of those ages that are gone, leaving hardly a sign and no memories. The earth seemed unearthly. We are accustomed to look upon the shackled form of a conquered monster, but there you could look at a thing monstrous and free. It was unearthly, and the men were, no, they were not inhuman. Well, you would know that was the worst of it. This suspicion of their not being inhuman, it would come slowly to one. They howled and leaped and spun and made horrid faces, but what thrilled you was just the thought of their humanity, like yours. The thought of your remote kinship was this wild and passionate uproar. Ugly. Yes, it was ugly enough, but if you were man enough, you would admit to yourself that there was in you just the faintest trace of a response to the terrible frankness of that noise, a dim suspicion of there being a meaning in it which you, so remote from the night of first ages, could comprehend. Thus, in Conrad, we can see the degrading semi-human starkness with which Africans were portrayed, and compared to anyone in Things Fall Apart, it is obvious how little Conrad thought of the African denizens of the European colonial empires. This is made even more clear when we discuss the legal and scientific framework that was in play in Europe during the latter half of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Noah Bassil, writing for the Australian Quarterly, explains, "The Indian Mutiny led to a questioning of the belief in the ability of non-Europeans to self-govern themselves effectively. It was also at this time that the theory of evolution emerged and the idea that in fact species could be differentiated as a result of evolutionary adaptability. It was increasingly argued by Europeans that their success in conquering the world and subjugating other races to their rule indicated an inherent superiority. The idea that it was possible for Indians or Africans to progress to the stage reached by Europeans was no longer an issue of education and tutelage. Rather, the inherent differences between the races determined the relative place in the world they would attain. Africans were relegated, along with the Australian Aborigine and Pacific Islanders, to a position of primitiveness. It was believed that the natives were unable to progress beyond the most basic levels of civilization. The result was the idea that Europeans should not only govern the colonies, but that the locals should only be allowed minimal authority in their own communities. African peoples were placed above apes but below Asians and Arabs, who it was argued demonstrated some level of civilization in the past, and the possibility for advancement of the African was far more remote than the of others. It was at this time that the idea of the childlike native, naive, innocent, and incapable of understanding complexities, became widespread. Okonkwo is subversive, not despite his ultramasculinity, but because of it. There is no doubt that Okonkwo is a flawed character, but there can also be no doubt that he is fully human. He is an obviously human character with obviously human flaws, and that is what makes him subversive of the literature that came before. Prior to Achebe, the literary African was a demi-human savage that functioned only as a mirror to the civilized white man. But afterward, we can see Okonkwo in the same vein of the flawed heroes tracing all the way back to Achilles and Hector. And I think that's the point, right? Of what Achebe was trying to write. Like, it's not about making a perfect character. It's not about making the ideal, African. It's about making a realistic character, a grounded character, somebody who was actually real. Somebody to show that Africans are real people and are valuable as characters in novels. Not just for their, not just as set dressing, but as characters in their own right. And they are fully human in a way that, isn't seen in Conrad or isn't seen in any literature prior to, the 1950s. So what can we take away from this second Bookshelf A to Z video? I think there's two things specifically. One, that thankfully not all the books I own are trash, which is, is a great burden off my shoulders. After the first book was Jerlaine, I keep talking about that book. I have a lot of things to say about it, and I didn't say it in the first video, but it's an interesting book. It's not a good book. It's not a good book. Things Fall Apart is both interesting and good. Jerlaine was just interesting, but not good, which is interesting in and of its own self. But the second thing I think is that reading is not a useless activity. It's not a pointless activity. It's not an activity that some would say is inefficient or whatnot. There is a reason, and it is because reading allows us to understanding the things that we read is it's important. That second part is important. Understanding what it is we're reading, because it allows us to help understand ourselves and the world around us, right? Okonkwo is not just a character in a book. he, he is a man that, we all know people like this. Well, at least I know people like this. It's people who try so hard to be masculine that they ruin their own lives and they ruin the lives of people around them. And obviously, you don't need to go. I think it's somewhat self-explanatory to say that obviously colonialism, we can see the effects of colonialism around us. That I think is unnecessary to say that. Obviously, that's a real factor. But you know, these books, despite this being a Nigerian novel written 70 years ago, it's still poignant. It's still not only it is not only relatable, but it is directly it's directly about things that we're still dealing with today. We're still dealing with masculinity. We're still dealing with what it means to be a man, what it means to be, how racism affects men and women, how racism affects the ability of black men to be masculine, and all of this stuff. Like this stuff, this book is about it. This is what this book is about. And I'm sure as we continue, there will be, I'm sure there will be duds, like Jerlaine. But also, there's great things. There's beautiful things written wonderfully that speak to us as readers. And anybody who says that isn't true, anybody who says that it's not that reading as an activity is not worthwhile, they're fools. They're fooling themselves. It's merely because they themselves are incapable of understanding what they're reading, so they assume that nobody can understand it. And it is worth understanding. It is worth reading and understanding these things because they help us to be better people. So I'm still looking forward to continuing this series. The next book is, I have it right here, No Longer at Ease, also by Chinua Achebe. It'll be shorter, I think, that video will be shorter, I think, than this one, because they cover not the same ground, but they're similar in theme. So I look forward to it. Thank you for watching. And if you have anything that you'd like to comment on, by all means, please comment. And like the video and all that jazz. You know what to do. You've been watching YouTube videos before, and I hope you enjoy it. And thank you for watching.